You are standing in a field somewhere in France. The year is 1347, and you're about to have the worst day of your life. Actually, scratch that. You're about to have another worst day of your life. Because when you're a medieval knight, pretty much every day is terrible in its own special way. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Right now, you're wearing about 70 pounds of metal that's slowly cooking you alive under the summer sun. You can barely see through the narrow slit in your helmet. You can't hear much of anything except your own labored breathing and the muffled sounds of 20,000 men preparing for battle. And you desperately, desperately need to pee. Welcome to the glamorous life of a medieval knight. Now I know what you're thinking, but knights were cool. They had swords and horses and went on quests and rescued maidens and lived in castles. And sure, the movies make it look pretty sweet. You've seen the films, knights in shining armor, noble deeds, chivalric romance, all that good stuff. Hell, even as kids, half of us wanted to be knights for Halloween. But here's the thing, being a medieval knight was actually a nightmare. And I don't mean that in a, oh, it was tough but honorable way. I mean, it was genuinely, horrifically awful in ways that would make a modern soldier look at you with pity. And we're going to explore exactly why, in excruciating detail, because that's what we do here. So buckle up, or rather buckle, on 70 pounds of increasingly uncomfortable metal, because we're about to dive into the reality of medieval knighthood. And trust me, it's going to get messy. Chapter 1, The Armor Problem, or How to Slowly Roast Yourself. Let's start with the most obvious issue, the armor, because when most people think of knights, they think of that iconic image, a dude covered head to toe in gleaming plate armor, looking absolutely badass. But here's what they don't tell you. That armor is trying to kill you. First, let's talk about weight. A full suit of plate armor, the kind that became standard by the 14th and 15th centuries, weighed anywhere from 45 to 70 pounds. Now, armor apologists will rush to tell you that this weight was well distributed across the body, and that knights were trained to move in it. And sure, that's technically true, but you know what else is true? 70 pounds is 70 pounds, and you're wearing it in situations where people are actively trying to murder you. Imagine doing an intense CrossFit workout while wearing a weighted vest that's half your body weight. Now imagine doing that workout while someone's shooting arrows at you and trying to bash your head in with a mace. Fun, right? But the weight is actually the least of your problems. The real issue is what that metal does in different weather conditions. In summer, you're basically turning yourself into a human rotisserie chicken. Metal conducts heat beautifully, which is great for cooking, but terrible when you're the thing being cooked. Knights would routinely suffer from heat exhaustion and heat stroke during summer campaigns. There are accounts of knights literally dying from overheating inside their armor, and it wasn't even particularly rare. One chronicler from the Crusades describes Christian knights in the Holy Land becoming so overheated that they would tear off their armor in the middle of battle just to avoid cooking to death, which of course meant they immediately got killed by the enemy instead. So pick your poison, death by heat stroke or death by sword. Medieval problems require medieval solutions. And winter? Oh, winter is special. Now that metal that was cooking you alive in summer becomes a freezer. Ever touched a metal pole with your tongue in winter? Yeah, now imagine that's your entire body all the time. Knights would stuff their armor with extra padding, usually wool or linen, to provide some insulation. But this had the delightful side effect of making the armor even heavier and more restrictive. Plus, metal gets brittle when it's cold, so now your protective equipment is more likely to crack or shatter if it takes a solid hit. Fantastic. But let's talk about the real elephant in the room, or rather, the knight in the armor going to the bathroom. This is the part where medieval historians get really uncomfortable, because the truth is, we don't have a ton of detailed information about how knights handled their biological needs while armored up, but we can make some educated guesses, and none of them are pleasant. A full suit of plate armor isn't like modern clothes where you can just unzip and go. You're talking about multiple layers of metal plates, straps, buckles, and a complex underlayer of padding. Getting into full armor could take 20 to 30 minutes with help from a squire or assistant. Getting out took just as long. So what did knights do during long battles or sieges? Well, some of them probably just held it for hours, sometimes days, which is not great for your bladder or your general health. Others likely relied on the fact that they were wearing multiple layers underneath the armor anyway, meaning yes, they probably just went in their padding and dealt with the consequences later. There are some references in medieval texts to knights smelling absolutely terrible after battles, and while some of that was surely blood, sweat, and the general funk of medieval hygiene, some of it was probably other stuff. And if you think that's bad, imagine having diarrhea in full plate armor during a 3-day siege. That's not just uncomfortable. That's a legitimate medical crisis that could lead to infections and disease. In fact, more knights probably died from infections caused by unsanitary conditions inside their armor than from enemy weapons, though we'll never know the exact numbers because medieval death certificates weren't exactly detailed. Now let's talk about the other fluid problem: sweat. When you're wearing 70 pounds of metal and engaging in intense physical activity, like say trying not to die, you sweat a lot. We're talking gallons of sweat over the course of a day. And where does that sweat go? It gets absorbed by your padded underlayers, which means you're now wearing wet, heavy padding under your metal suit. This creates a lovely environment for bacteria and fungi to thrive. Skin infections, rashes, and various kinds of rot were constant companions for knights. There are medical texts from the period discussing treatments for armor rot, skin conditions caused by prolonged contact with sweaty, dirty padding. The treatments were about as pleasant as you'd expect from medieval medicine, involving things like applying hot irons to the affected areas or rubbing them with various ointments made from animal fat and herbs. But wait, there's more. The combination of metal and moisture means rust. Your armor would start to rust from the inside, with your own sweat literally corroding your protective equipment. Knights had to spend hours maintaining their armor, oiling it inside and out, trying to prevent rust damage. And if you couldn't afford good armor maintenance, which many couldn't, as we'll discuss later, you might find that your armor had literally rusted to your padded underlayer, or worse, to your skin. There are accounts of knights having to have armor cut off them after battles because the combination of blood, sweat, and rust had essentially welded the metal to their bodies. The process of removing this armor would tear off skin and cause horrific wounds that would often become infected. So even if you survived the battle, you might die from the armor removal process, the gift that keeps on giving. And let's not forget about visibility. That cool helmet with the narrow eye slit. It means you can see approximately nothing. Your peripheral vision is completely gone. You can basically only see what's directly in front of you. And even that's limited. Fighting in armor has been compared to fighting while looking through a cardboard tube. Some helmets had slightly better visibility, but those were usually less protective, so again, pick your poison. The hearing situation is even worse. That metal helmet means you can barely hear anything except muffled sounds. Trying to hear orders in battle? Good luck. Trying to hear someone sneaking up behind you? Not happening. Knights relied heavily on prearranged signals and plans because verbal communication during battle was basically impossible. Oh, and speaking of the helmet, let's talk about what happens when you take a hit to the head. Even if the helmet does its job and prevents the sword or mace from penetrating, you're still dealing with massive blunt force trauma. Concussions were so common among knights that they were just considered part of the job. Multiple concussions over a career would lead to what we now recognize as traumatic brain injury, causing memory problems, personality changes, and early cognitive decline. Medieval people didn't understand CTE, but they definitely noticed that old knights often seemed confused, aggressive, or mentally impaired. They just attributed it to the general wear and tear of a warrior's life. not realizing it was literally brain damage from repeated head trauma. And here's a fun one: drowning. Knights in full armor who fell into water had approximately zero chance of survival. The armor would drag them straight to the bottom, and even if they could swim, most couldn't. Swimming wasn't considered a necessary skill for nobility. They couldn't do it in 70 pounds of metal. There are multiple battles in medieval history where more knights died from drowning than from combat. The Battle of the Golden Spurs in 1302 saw Flemish infantry deliberately driving French knights into water obstacles where they sank like stones and drowned. At the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, English knights fleeing the Scottish forces drowned in the River Forth by the hundreds when the bridge collapsed under the weight of armored men. Even crossing rivers during campaigns was a potential death sentence. Knights either had to remove their armor, making them vulnerable, or risk drowning if something went wrong. And something often went wrong, but perhaps the most insidious problem with armor was this: it made you a target. A knight in full plate armor was clearly a person of wealth and status, which meant two things. First, enemy soldiers would specifically target you because killing or capturing a knight was worth more than killing a regular soldier. We'll get into the ransom system later, but trust me, it's its own nightmare. Second, your own side expected more from you. You were supposed to be at the front of every charge, the last to retreat, the one taking the most risks. Your armor was supposed to protect you, but it also painted a giant target on your back that said, "I'm important, kill me for glory and profit." So there you have it. The armor that's supposed to be the symbol of knightly power and protection was actually a prison that could cook you, freeze you, rust onto your body, give you infections, block your vision and hearing, give you brain damage, drown you, and make you a priority target for every enemy on the battlefield. Still want to be a knight? Chapter 2, The Training Nightmare, or Your Childhood is Now Over. But let's back up. You don't just wake up one day as a knight in uncomfortable armor. No, you have to earn that privilege through years of training that would make modern military boot camp look like a relaxing spa vacation if you were born into a noble family. And let's be clear, you had to be born into the right family to become a knight. Your childhood, as you knew it, ended around age 7. 7. The age when modern kids are still losing their baby teeth and learning long division. At 7 years old, you'd be sent away from your family to serve as a page in another noble's household. And I do mean sent away, often to a castle or manor days or weeks of travel from your home. You probably wouldn't see your parents more than once or twice a year, if that. Some boys never saw their families again until they were adults. Why send you away instead of training you at home? Because medieval nobles believed that fathers would be too soft on their own sons. Better to send your boy to someone else's household where he could be properly toughened up, while you did the same to someone else's son. It was like a medieval student exchange program, except instead of learning about cultural differences, you were learning how to kill people. As a page, your life was basically servitude disguised as education. Sure, you got some actual education. You'd learn to read and write, study languages, usually Latin and French, learn music, study religion, and all that. Good stuff. But you were also a servant. You'd serve meals to the knights and nobles. You'd clean their chambers. You'd help them dress. You'd care for their horses and equipment. You'd run errands. You were essentially a combination student and unpaid intern, working 16-hour days with no weekends off. Oh, and the discipline was brutal. Medieval teaching methods weren't big on positive reinforcement. Screw up your Latin conjugations? That's a beating. Spill wine while serving at table? Beating. Move too slowly when helping a knight with his armor? You better believe that's a beating. We have records from the period of pages being hit with rods, straps, and sometimes fists for minor infractions. Some masters were worse than others, but physical punishment was considered not just acceptable, but necessary for proper education. The philosophy was literally, spare the rod, spoil the child. And this wasn't like getting detention or being grounded. We're talking about actual Physical beatings hard enough to leave bruises, welts, and sometimes worse. There are accounts of pages dying from punishment that went too far, and the perpetrators usually faced little to no consequences because, hey, they were just trying to properly educate the boy. But the real training started around age 14, when you graduated from page to squire. Congratulations, your reward for 7 years of servitude is more servitude, but now with weapons. As a squire, you were assigned to a specific knight who would train you in the art of warfare. You'd learn swordplay, lance work, mounted combat, strategy, and all the skills you'd need to not die immediately in battle. But you'd also continue serving your knight in every possible way. You were responsible for maintaining his armor and weapons. This meant hours of polishing metal, oiling joints, sharpening blades, and checking every strap and buckle for wear. A knight's life depended on his equipment, which meant your life depended on doing this job perfectly. Mess up, and your knight might die in battle, and you'd be blamed, punished, and probably never become a knight yourself. You'd care for his horses, which in the medieval period was almost as important as caring for the armor. A warhorse was phenomenally expensive, costing as much as a small farm, and required constant care and training. You'd feed them, groom them, exercise them, and train them for combat. If the horse got sick or injured on your watch, that was on you. You'd help your knight get dressed for battle, which, as we've discussed, was a complex and time-consuming process. You'd hand him weapons during tournaments or battles. You'd be expected to follow him into combat. Yes, into actual combat, where people were trying to kill everyone, and assist him however you could. And here's the kicker. While you were doing all of this, you were also expected to continue your own training. After serving your knight all day, you would practice combat skills, study military strategy, work on your horsemanship, and maintain your own equipment. Sleep was something that happened occasionally, if you were lucky. The combat training itself was no joke. This wasn't modern fencing with safety equipment and rules. You trained with real weapons, or blunted weapons that could still break bones and cause serious injuries. Training injuries were incredibly common. There are records of squires losing eyes, breaking limbs, suffering concussions, and sometimes dying during training. One popular training method was the quinton, a pivoting dummy with a shield on one side and a weighted bag on the other. You'd charge at it on horseback with a lance, trying to hit the shield. If your aim was off or your timing was wrong, the weighted bag would swing around and smack you off your horse. This was considered good fun and excellent training, despite the fact that it regularly resulted in broken bones and concussions. Tournaments, which we'll discuss more later, were another form of training. Young squires would participate in the melee events, basically organized riots where dozens or hundreds of men would beat each other senseless with blunted weapons. These events regularly resulted in serious injuries and occasional deaths, but they were considered essential for learning real combat skills. And let's talk about the physical requirements. To function as a knight, you needed to be in absolutely peak physical condition. You had to be strong enough to fight in armor for hours, skilled enough to wield weapons with precision, and coordinated enough to do all of this while riding a warhorse. The training regimen was brutal. You'd spend hours every day practicing sword forms, building up the specific muscles and muscle memory needed for combat. You'd do strength training, lifting heavy objects, carrying armor, wrestling with other squires. You'd do endurance training, running, riding, fighting for extended periods without rest. Medieval people didn't have modern nutrition science, so you weren't getting protein shakes and carefully balanced macros. You ate whatever the castle or manor provided, which was often heavy on bread and meat, but lacking in other nutrients. Malnutrition was common even among the wealthy, leading to various deficiency diseases that would sap your strength and stamina. Oh, and remember, you're going through all of this training during puberty. Your body is already going through massive changes and requires extra nutrition and rest. Instead, you're getting inadequate food and sleep while engaging in brutal physical training that would challenge a fully grown adult. The psychological toll was immense. You were separated from your family at a young age, subjected to harsh discipline and frequent punishment, worked to exhaustion, put in dangerous situations regularly, and constantly evaluated on your worthiness to join the knightly class. Many boys simply couldn't handle it. Some ran away, though being a runaway noble with no skills except warfare was not a great position to be in. Some had mental breakdowns. Some became bitter, cruel men who would later inflict the same treatment on their own pages and squires. The cycle of trauma continued. And after all of this, after 7 years as a page, and typically another 7 as a squire, you might, if you were lucky and skilled, and didn't die or get permanently injured, be dubbed a knight around age 21. Congratulations. Your reward for 14 years of servitude, brutal training, and psychological trauma is everything we discussed in Chapter 1 forever. Chapter 3, The Money Problem, or How to Go Bankrupt While Being Rich. Now here's something the movies never talk about. Being a knight was phenomenally, catastrophically expensive. We're talking about a level of financial burden that would make a modern person with student loans look at you with sympathy. Let's start with the basics. That armor we discussed earlier, it cost a fortune. A full suit of plate armor in the 14th or 15th century could cost anywhere from 100 to 400 pounds. To put that in perspective, a skilled craftsman might earn 3 to 4 pounds per year. A full suit of the best armor cost more than a master craftsman would earn in their entire lifetime. Even cheaper mail armor, which was more common earlier in the medieval period, cost around 20 to 40 pounds, still representing multiple years of income for most people. And armor wasn't a one-time purchase. It needed constant maintenance and repair. Battle damage, rust, and general wear and tear meant you were constantly spending money on your equipment. A serious battle could leave your armor so damaged that it needed extensive repairs or replacement, costing as much as buying new armor in the first place. Then there were weapons. A good sword cost 1 to 2 pounds, again representing months or years of income for ordinary people. Lances, maces, daggers, and other weapons added to the cost. And like armor, weapons needed maintenance and occasional replacement. But the real money sink was horses. Oh boy, the horses. A proper war horse, called a destrier, could cost 30 to 100 pounds or more. For the absolute best war horses, prices could go even higher. There are records of exceptional destriers selling for prices equivalent to a small estate. And you couldn't just have one horse. A knight needed multiple horses, a destrier for battle, a courser for travel, a palfrey for comfortable riding, and pack horses for carrying equipment. You'd easily need 3 to 5 horses minimum, and wealthy knights might have a dozen or more. Horses require constant care and feeding. A war horse could eat 20 to 25 pounds of grain and hay per day. That might not sound like much, but multiply it by multiple horses over months or years, and the costs add up fast. You also needed grooms and stable hands to care for the horses, which meant more salaries to pay. And horses died, frequently. Battle, disease, accidents, old age. Horses were fragile and expensive, and you had to keep replacing them. A horse might last 5 to 10 years if you were lucky, meaning you were constantly buying new ones. Speaking of salaries, let's talk about your support staff. A knight couldn't function alone. You needed a squire, as we've discussed, but you also needed grooms for the horses, servants for daily tasks, and often men-at-arms to fight alongside you. All of these people needed to be fed, housed, clothed, and paid. A modest knight might have a household of 5 to 10 people to support. A wealthy knight could have dozens. Each person represented ongoing costs that never stopped. Then there were the social obligations. Knights were expected to maintain a certain standard of living and display of wealth. You needed fine clothes for yourself and your family, and medieval nobles changed clothes frequently as a sign of wealth. You needed to host feasts and entertain guests. You needed to give gifts to other nobles and to your lord. You needed to support the church with donations and tithes. Basically, if you wanted to maintain your status as a knight and nobleman, you had to constantly spend money to prove you had money. It was a never-ending cycle of expensive social performance. And here's where things get really fun. Tournaments. Tournaments were supposed to be opportunities to win glory and prizes, but they were also incredibly expensive to participate in. First, you had to travel to wherever the tournament was being held, often bringing your entire household with you. That meant transportation costs, lodging, food, and other expenses for potentially weeks. Second, you needed special tournament equipment, blunted weapons, specialized armor, and horses trained for tournament combat. Some knights maintained completely separate sets of equipment just for tournaments. Third, there were entry fees for mini tournaments. And if you lost, which statistically most knights did most of the time, you might have to pay ransoms or forfeit equipment to the winners. Some knights went into debt or even bankruptcy because of tournament losses. But wait, you might say, didn't knights get paid? Didn't they have land and income? Well, yes and no. It's complicated. Some knights held land as part of the feudal system and could collect rents and taxes from the peasants who worked that land. But not all knights had substantial land holdings. Younger sons, for instance, typically inherited little or nothing, as estates usually went to the eldest son. These landless knights had to find other ways to support themselves. Some knights served in the households of greater nobles or royalty and received salaries for their service, but these salaries often weren't enough to cover all the expenses we've discussed. You might receive room and board and a small cash payment, but you still had to maintain your own expensive equipment and horses. Many knights supplemented their income by essentially working as mercenaries, selling their military services to whoever would pay. During times of war, you could make decent money this way. During peacetime, not so much. And here's the real kicker. You were expected to provide military service to your lord for free for a certain number of days per year, typically 40 days. That meant you had to take time away from managing your lands or earning money elsewhere to fulfill your feudal obligations without compensation. If your lord called for military service beyond those 40 days, you might get paid, but the rates were often not enough to cover your actual costs. And if you refused to serve, you could lose your land and titles. So you were trapped in a system where you had to provide expensive military service or risk losing everything. Let's do some rough math. Say you're a modest knight with 1 suit of armor, 100 pounds, needing repairs/replacement every 10 years. Weapons, 10 pounds, needing occasional replacement. 3 horses, 80 pounds total, needing replacement every 7 years on average. Horse feed and care, 20 pounds per year. Support staff, squire, 2 servants, 1 groom. 15 pounds per year in wages and upkeep. Clothing and social obligations, 10 pounds per year. Maintenance and miscellaneous, 10 pounds per year. That's a minimum of about 55 pounds per year in ongoing costs, plus the occasional massive expense of replacing armor or horses. And that's for a modest knight living relatively frugally. Wealthy knights could easily spend several hundred pounds per year. Meanwhile, a knight's manor might generate 30 to 60 pounds per year in income if you were lucky and had decent land. See the problem? Most knights operated at a loss or barely broke even. They made up the difference through various means: careful management of their estates, taking on additional paid military service, winning tournaments if they were skilled enough, arranging profitable marriages, or occasionally through less savory means, like extortion, banditry, or abusing their peasants with excessive taxes and fees. This financial pressure created a whole class of knight-errant, basically unemployed knights wandering around looking for opportunities to make money through military service, tournaments, or sometimes outright robbery. The romantic stories paint these guys as noble adventurers seeking glory. The reality was usually desperate men trying to avoid bankruptcy, and God help you if you were captured in battle and had to pay a ransom. Ransoms could be absolutely ruinous, sometimes costing more than a knight would earn in decades. Knights captured in battle might have to sell their lands, borrow money at predatory interest rates, or rely on their lord or family to pay the ransom. Some knights never recovered financially from being captured once. There are documented cases of knights who were captured, ransomed, went into debt, had to sell their lands, and basically ended up impoverished despite their noble status, all because they did their job and happened to lose one battle. The money problem affected everything else about knightly life. Can't afford good armor? You're more likely to die in battle. Can't afford enough horses? You can't fulfill your military obligations or travel to tournaments. Can't afford to maintain your social status. You lose the respect of other nobles and might not be able to arrange good marriages for your children, perpetuating the financial problems into the next generation. It was a vicious cycle, and many knightly families slowly slid into poverty over generations, unable to maintain the crushing expenses of their status. So you had to be wealthy to become a knight, but being a knight was one of the best ways to go broke. Makes perfect sense, right? Chapter 4, The Battle Reality, or Nothing Like the Movies. All right, let's talk about actual combat, because this is where the medieval fantasy really falls apart. In movies, battles are glorious affairs. Knights charge heroically, engage in dramatic one-on-one duels, fight with honor and skill, and either win gloriously or die heroically. It's all very clean and cinematic. Real medieval battles were nothing like this. They were chaotic, terrifying nightmares that would traumatize you for life if you survived at all. First, let's address the charging on horseback thing that looks so cool in every medieval movie ever made. Yes, cavalry charges happened. Yes, they could be devastating, but they were also incredibly dangerous for the knights involved. When you charge at full speed on a war horse, you're moving at about 30 miles per hour while wearing 70 pounds of metal and holding a 12-foot lance. If you hit an obstacle, another horse, an enemy soldier, a hidden ditch, literally anything, you and your horse are going down hard. Falling off a horse at speed while wearing full armor could easily be fatal. The impact alone could break your neck or spine. If you survived the fall, you'd likely be stunned, and now you're lying on the ground in 70 pounds of metal that's very difficult to get up from, while enemies surround you, trying to find gaps in your armor to stab you. Oh, and horses. They don't want to charge into a mass of people or other horses. It goes against their survival instincts. You had to train war horses extensively to overcome their natural reluctance to run into dangerous situations. And even then, horses would sometimes refuse or panic at critical moments. Some battles saw cavalry charges falter because the horses simply stopped or turned aside at the last moment, despite the knights' best efforts. Nothing quite like planning your entire battle strategy around a cavalry charge, only to have your horses decide, actually no thanks, at the crucial moment. And speaking of battle strategy, here's something else the movies get wrong. Battles weren't mainly about skilled individual combat. They were about masses of men crushing into each other in formation and trying to break the enemy's line through sheer force and numbers. When battle lines met, you didn't have room for fancy swordplay. You were packed shoulder to shoulder with your fellow soldiers, surrounded by enemies, all of you pushing and shoving and trying to stab or bash whoever was in front of you. It was more like a rugby scrum than a duel, except everyone has sharp objects and is trying to kill each other. Your expensive sword training? Mostly useless in this situation. When you're crammed together with dozens of other men, you can't do complicated sword techniques. You're reduced to basically stabbing forward or bringing your weapon down on whoever's in front of you, over and over, until either they die, you die, or one side breaks and runs. The noise was overwhelming. Thousands of men shouting, screaming, metal clashing on metal, horses neighing, wounded men crying out. You couldn't hear orders. You could barely hear yourself think. Communication broke down almost immediately once battle was joined. The smell was even worse. Thousands of unwashed men who'd been marching for weeks, mixed with horse manure, blood, and the smell of open bowels. Because that's what happens when you stab someone in the stomach. Add in the fact that terrified men often lose control of their bladders and bowels, and you've got a sensory experience that would make you gag. And the terror. Oh, the terror. You need to understand that for most of history, humans didn't have the psychological conditioning to make killing easy. modern military training uses specific techniques to overcome people's natural reluctance to kill other humans. Medieval soldiers had no such training. So you've got men who don't really want to kill, terrified of being killed, surrounded by chaos and horror, and somehow expected to function effectively in combat. Is it any wonder that battles often consisted of two sides facing each other, working up the courage to actually engage, and then when they finally did clash, one side would break and run pretty quickly? Most medieval battles didn't last days. The actual fighting usually lasted a few hours at most, and often just minutes before one side broke and fled. The real killing happened during the rout, when the losing side was running away, and the winning side was chasing them down and slaughtering them from behind. And here's where being a knight in armor became a huge liability. Remember how we discussed that armor makes it hard to move? Try running for your life in 70 pounds of metal. You can't. You're slow and awkward and easy to catch. Some knights would throw off their helmets or even pieces of armor to run faster, but this made them more vulnerable. Many knights who survived the actual battle were killed during the retreat because they simply couldn't get away. If you did, go down in battle, whether from being knocked off your horse, slipping in the mud, being overwhelmed, or just tripping in that awkward armor, you were in serious trouble. Getting up from the ground in full plate armor required either help from a companion or considerable time and effort that you didn't have in the middle of a battle. Enemies would swarm down knights, looking for gaps in the armor to exploit. The joints, armpits, groin, neck, back of the knee were vulnerable points where lighter armor or just padding protected you. A dagger thrust into one of these gaps could kill you despite your expensive armor. Or they might not bother finding a gap. Instead, they just beat you with heavy weapons until the blunt force trauma killed you or knocked you unconscious. Your helmet protected you from cuts, but it couldn't fully protect you from the concussive force of a mace or warhammer slamming into your head repeatedly. There's a reason specialized anti-armor weapons, like warhammers and poleaxes, became popular in the later medieval period. When everyone's wearing plate armor, you need weapons designed to deal with that armor, either by finding gaps or by delivering such massive blunt force that the armor doesn't matter. And let's talk about what actually happens to a human body in combat, because this is grim but important for understanding why battle was so horrific. Sword wounds, if they got through your armor, could cut deep into muscle and bone. If a major artery was cut, and there are lots of major arteries in the human body, you could bleed out in minutes. Medieval medicine had no way to deal with this. You just died. Arrow wounds were particularly nasty. Arrows could punch through gaps in armor or through lighter armor entirely. The bodkin point arrows used against armor weren't designed to come out cleanly. They'd stick in flesh and bone, and trying to remove them often caused more damage than the initial wound. Some arrows were barbed, designed to cause maximum damage and be nearly impossible to remove. Surgeons would sometimes have to push the arrow completely through the body and out the other side, then cut off the point before pulling the shaft back through. Without anesthesia, the survival rate was not great. Crushing injuries from maces and warhammers would break bones, rupture internal organs, and cause internal bleeding. You might seem fine initially, then die hours or days later from internal injuries that medieval medicine couldn't diagnose or treat. And then there were the infections. Any wound that broke the skin was at risk of infection, and medieval battlefields were filthy places. Rusty weapons, dirty armor, unwashed bodies, soil, and manure. All of these meant that even minor wounds could become infected. Without antibiotics, infections were often fatal. You might survive the battle, seem to be recovering from your wounds, and then die a week later from sepsis. Or you might survive the infection but end up with permanent disabilities, amputations, chronic pain, limited mobility. Oh, and speaking of amputations, medieval surgery for severe limb injuries basically consisted of cut off the limb, cauterize the wound with a hot iron or boiling oil, and hope the patient doesn't die from shock or infection. The survival rate was maybe 50-50 if you were lucky and had a skilled surgeon. Many wounded knights chose to refuse amputation and risk dying from their wounds rather than face the horror of medieval surgery. But let's say you do everything right. You survive the charge, survive the melee. Don't fall off your horse. Don't get overwhelmed. Don't get separated from your allies. You're winning. Your side is victorious. Congratulations. Now comes the looting and the war crimes. Medieval armies didn't have military police or strict discipline. After a victory, armies would often turn into mobs, looting the bodies of the dead and wounded, stealing anything of value, and frequently killing wounded enemies rather than taking them prisoner. And it wasn't just enemy wounded who got looted. Your own dead and dying comrades would be stripped of valuables by whoever got to them first. That expensive armor you paid a fortune for? If you die, it's getting stolen, possibly by your own side. Towns and villages near battlefields were often sacked, regardless of which side they were on. Victorious armies would rampage through civilian areas, stealing food and valuables, burning buildings, assaulting women, and killing anyone who resisted. This was just considered normal aftermath of battle. As a knight, you were expected to participate in this, or at least turn a blind eye. The rules of chivalry that supposedly governed knightly conduct, those applied to how you treated other nobles, not to commoners. Peasants weren't protected by chivalric codes. Some knights genuinely tried to maintain discipline and prevent atrocities. Others enthusiastically participated. Most probably fell somewhere in between, disgusted by what they saw, but not willing to risk their own standing by interfering too much. And all of this, the terror, the violence, the death, the atrocities, would stick with you. We don't have good records of PTSD from the medieval period because psychology wasn't a thing yet, but we do have accounts of knights who became withdrawn, had nightmares, became violent and unstable, turned to alcohol, or joined monasteries to escape their memories. The shell-shocked knight, haunted by battle, appears in enough medieval literature and chronicles that it was clearly a recognized phenomenon, even if they didn't have a medical term for it. So yeah, battle. Not like the movies, more like a nightmare that has a good chance of killing or permanently traumatizing you. And even if you survive, you get to participate in or witness war crimes. Living the dream. Chapter 5. The tournament circuit, or paid to get brain damage. Okay, so actual warfare is a nightmare. But what about tournaments? Those were supposed to be the fun part of being a knight, right? Sporting events where you could show off your skills, win glory, and earn prizes without all the death and horror of real battle? Well, not exactly. Early medieval tournaments, we're talking 11th and 12th centuries here, were barely distinguishable from actual battles. They were massive melees where hundreds of knights would divide into two teams and just beat the hell out of each other across miles of countryside. These weren't carefully controlled sporting events. They were organized riots. Knights would charge each other with lances, hack at each other with swords, deliberately target valuable opponents to capture for ransom, and generally fight as hard as they would in actual war. People died at these tournaments, frequently. We're not talking about rare accidents. Deaths were common enough that the church repeatedly tried to ban tournaments, calling them sinful wastes of life. The bans didn't work, of course, because nobles loved tournaments, but the church kept trying. Geoffrey de Mandeville, a prominent English knight, died in a tournament in 1216. William de Montfort died in a tournament in 1191. These weren't obscure knights. These were important nobles, and they died in what were supposed to be sporting events. And for every knight who died, many more were seriously injured. Broken bones, concussions, crushed limbs, losing eyes or teeth. All just part of the tournament experience. Why were tournaments so dangerous? Several reasons. First, the weapons were often real, or only slightly blunted. Even blunted weapons could cave in helmets, break bones, and cause massive internal injuries. Some knights used their actual war gear in tournaments because they couldn't afford separate equipment. Second, the motivation was serious. Remember that financial pressure we discussed? Tournaments were one of the few ways for knights to make money during peacetime. If you captured another knight during a tournament melee, You could ransom them and their equipment. This could be hugely profitable. So knights fought in tournaments like their financial lives depended on it, because they often did. This wasn't friendly sporting competition. This was economic warfare with weapons. William Marshall, arguably the most famous tournament knight of the 12th century, made a fortune on the tournament circuit. He and his partner, Roger de Gaugy, captured 103 knights over a 10-month period. 103. They were running what was essentially a very violent for-profit enterprise, but for every William Marshall who got rich from tournaments, there were dozens of knights who lost everything. Remember, if you got captured, you had to pay a ransom for yourself and your equipment. Lose badly enough, and you could be financially ruined. Some knights went into debt to pay tournament ransoms, then had to enter more tournaments to try to win back their losses, creating a vicious cycle, not unlike modern gambling addiction. Except instead of losing money at poker, you were losing money while getting hit in the head with metal objects. As the medieval period progressed, tournaments became somewhat more regulated and safer. By the 13th and 14th centuries, the massive cross-country melees were being replaced with more controlled events in enclosed lists, tournament grounds, with more rules and better equipment. But safer is relative. These later tournaments still featured the joust, two knights charging at each other with lances at full speed. If you've ever seen a jousting accident, you know how bad these could be. A lance strike to the head or chest could kill you instantly, even with armor. The force of impact was tremendous. Lances would shatter, sending wooden splinters flying. These could penetrate gaps in armor or, in unlucky cases, go through the eye slit of a helmet and into the brain. King Henry II of France died from exactly this kind of injury in 1559. During a joust, a lance splintered, and a fragment went through his visor into his eye and brain. He lingered for 10 days before dying. This was a king with access to the best medical care available, and he still died from a tournament injury. And Henry wasn't alone. Numerous nobles and knights died in jousting accidents throughout the medieval period. It was dangerous enough that some regions required special licenses for hosting tournaments, and participants sometimes had to post bonds guaranteeing they wouldn't seek revenge if they were injured. But even if you didn't die, the repeated head trauma from tournament after tournament was catastrophic for your long-term health. Remember those concussions we talked about? Tournament knights got them regularly. William Marshall, that successful tournament champion, contemporary accounts describe him in later life as having memory problems and periods of confusion. Modern analysis of the descriptions suggests he was probably suffering from chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, from repeated head injuries. And the injuries weren't just to the head. Knights suffered broken bones, dislocated joints, torn muscles, and various other trauma from tournament combat. Many knights walked with limps or had limited use of arms or hands from old tournament injuries. Plus, there was the psychological aspect. Tournaments were social events where your reputation was on the line. Lose badly, and you'd be mocked by your peers. Refuse to participate, and you'd be seen as cowardly. You were pressured to constantly prove yourself, even if you were injured or not feeling up to it. And let's not forget the expense. We touched on this earlier, but it bears repeating. Tournaments were expensive to enter. You had to travel there with your household, pay entry fees, maintain your equipment, and risk losing everything if you were defeated and ransomed. Even successful tournament knights often barely broke, even after accounting for all their expenses. Only the very best could actually make significant profit. The tournament circuit was also politically complex. Tournaments weren't just sporting events, they were social and political gatherings where alliances were formed, disputes were settled or started, and nobles jockeyed for position and favor. You had to be careful about who you challenged, who you defeated, and how you conducted yourself. Accidentally embarrass an important noble in a tournament? You might make a powerful enemy. Refuse a challenge from someone influential. Same problem. Some tournaments were specifically organized as political statements or tests of loyalty. Your lord might expect you to participate to show support. or rivals might organize tournaments as ways to embarrass or challenge your faction. Navigating all of this required political savvy on top of combat skills. You weren't just fighting, you were engaging in complex social and political maneuvering where one wrong move could affect your career and prospects for years. And here's a fun aspect nobody talks about. The pageantry and ceremony surrounding tournaments was exhausting in its own right. You were expected to participate in processions, feasts, religious services, and various social events surrounding the actual combat. This meant hours in uncomfortable formal clothing, making small talk with nobles you might not like, observing complex etiquette rules, and generally performing the role of a courtly knight, even when you'd rather be resting or preparing for the next day's combat. Tournaments could last for days or even weeks, and you were on the entire time. The social and political performance was nearly as demanding as the physical combat. Oh, and one more thing. Tournaments sometimes turned into actual battles. Political tensions would boil over. Old rivalries would flare up. And what started as a sporting event would turn into real violence with real casualties. There are multiple documented cases of tournaments that turned into small wars, with participants bringing in reinforcements, besieging nearby castles, and engaging in actual military campaigns that started over tournament disputes. So tournaments, not the fun, sporting break from warfare that you might have hoped for. More like slightly more organized violence, with the same risks of death and injury, plus financial gambling, political maneuvering, and the constant pressure to perform and maintain your reputation. At least in actual war, you weren't expected to smile and make small talk at a feast afterward with the guy who tried to kill you that afternoon. Chapter 6. The Ransom System, or Welcome to Medieval Kidnapping as a Business Model. Alright, we need to talk about one of the weirdest and most exploitative aspects of medieval knighthood, the ransom system. Because it turns out that being a knight didn't just mean you could be killed in battle. It meant you could be captured and held for ransom, turning you into a very expensive hostage. Here's how it worked. In medieval warfare, killing enemy knights was actually discouraged in many situations. Why? Because a dead knight is worth nothing, but a captured knight is worth a fortune. When you captured an enemy knight in battle, you basically owned them until their ransom was paid. The ransom amount was negotiated based on the knight's wealth and status, typically equivalent to 1 year's income, but sometimes much more for important nobles. For a minor knight, that might be 20 to 50 pounds. For a wealthy baron, hundreds of pounds. For a king? Well, King Richard I of England was captured in 1192, and his ransom was set at 150,000 marks, roughly 100,000 pounds, an absolutely staggering sum that required raising taxes across England and literally bankrupted the kingdom. Now you might think, well, at least there were rules about this. It was civilized. And technically, yes, there were rules. The laws of chivalry dictated that captors should treat their prisoners with respect, provide adequate food and lodging, and not demand unreasonable ransoms. In practice, those rules were honored more in the breach than the observance. Some captors treated their prisoners well, housing them comfortably, and even allowing them some freedom while ransom was arranged. Others kept their prisoners in actual dungeons, in chains, in terrible conditions, as leverage to speed up ransom payment, and the ransom negotiations could drag on for months or even years. During this time, you were stuck wherever your captor decided to keep you, separated from your family, unable to manage your estates, and watching your financial situation deteriorate. Because here's the thing, while you were imprisoned, your lands and income didn't stop existing, but you couldn't manage them. Stewards or family members might handle things in your absence, but not as well as you would. Revenues would decline. Expenses would continue, and all the while, you'd be accruing debt from the ransom you'd eventually have to pay. Some knights were captured multiple times over their careers. Each capture meant another crushing ransom, more debt, more time away from home. It was entirely possible to spend years of your life as a prisoner, paying ransoms that would financially cripple your family for generations. And if your family or lord couldn't or wouldn't pay, well, you might just stay imprisoned indefinitely. There are records of knights spending decades in captivity because no one could raise their ransom. Bertrand du Guesclin, a famous French knight, was captured multiple times and had to pay multiple ransoms throughout his career. The financial burden was so severe that even though he was one of the most successful military commanders of his era, he died in debt. But it gets worse. The ransom system created perverse incentives that warped medieval warfare in disturbing ways. First, it meant that battles often involved more focus on capturing valuable prisoners than on actually winning the fight. Knights would specifically target other knights for capture, rather than trying to break the enemy formation or achieve strategic objectives. Imagine being in the middle of a battle, and instead of your fellow knights protecting you or fighting effectively, they're all trying to capture enemy nobles for the ransom money. Your side might lose the battle because everyone was more focused on profit than victory. Second, it created a situation where the wealthy and powerful were safer in battle than common soldiers. If you were a knight, enemies had incentive to capture you alive. If you were a peasant foot soldier, no ransom value, so enemies would just kill you. This meant that the people who could best afford to pay for the best armor and horses, the nobles, were also the most likely to survive battle because of their ransom value. Meanwhile, poor soldiers who couldn't afford good equipment were both more vulnerable and more likely to be killed rather than captured. The ransom system literally made warfare safer for the rich and more dangerous for the poor. Third, it created opportunities for abuse and what we'd now call war profiteering. Some knights became essentially professional captors, focusing on capturing as many valuable prisoners as possible and extorting maximum ransoms from them. There are accounts of knights deliberately targeting rich but militarily incompetent nobles, capturing them, and then demanding ransoms far beyond what was considered fair. The victim couldn't really refuse. The alternative was indefinite imprisonment or, in some cases, death, and some captors would pile on additional fees beyond the ransom itself. Want better accommodations while imprisoned? That costs extra. Want to send letters to your family? Pay up. Want adequate food? Hope you've got money. It was essentially a medieval protection racket, except instead of threatening to burn down your shop, they'd already captured you in battle and were now threatening to keep you imprisoned forever. Oh, and here's a fun wrinkle. Sometimes knights would be captured by their own side. In the chaos of battle, you couldn't always tell who was on which side, especially if you fell off your horse and ended up surrounded. Some knights were captured by their supposed allies, who would then demand ransom anyway, but were on the same side. Yeah, but you're worth money, so ransom, please. There wasn't always a lot you could do about it either, proving that you were friendly forces while lying on the ground in armor, probably concussed, surrounded by armed men who saw a profit opportunity. Good luck with that. The ransom system also affected battle tactics in weird ways. Knights would sometimes refuse to fight in situations where capture was likely, even if the battle was strategically important. Why risk being captured and financially ruined? This meant that commanders couldn't always count on their knights to fight when and where needed. Some battles were lost or never fought because knights calculated that the risk of capture and ransom wasn't worth it. And it created bizarre situations where personal financial considerations overrode military necessity. There are accounts of knights abandoning defensive positions or refusing to pursue defeated enemies because the risk-reward calculation didn't favor them personally. Imagine if modern soldiers could just opt out of dangerous missions because they were worried about the financial consequences. That's essentially what the ransom system allowed. Now you might ask, couldn't you just refuse to surrender and fight to the death instead? Theoretically, yes. In practice, not really. If you were overwhelmed and facing certain death versus probable capture, most people chose capture. And the medieval code of chivalry actually encouraged surrender over pointless death. It was considered more honorable to surrender to a worthy opponent than to die feudally. But here's the really dark part. The ransom system only applied to nobles and knights. Remember those peasant soldiers we mentioned? If they were captured, they had no ransom value, so they were often just killed out of hand, or if they were lucky, enslaved. This created situations where, after a battle, captured knights would be treated relatively well and eventually ransomed, while captured common soldiers were massacred. We're talking about hundreds or thousands of prisoners being executed after battles because they weren't worth keeping alive. The Battle of Agincourt in 1415 is infamous for this. Henry V of England ordered the execution of French prisoners during the battle because he was worried about being overwhelmed if the prisoners fought back. The knights and nobles were spared for ransom, but the common soldiers killed. So the ransom system protected the wealthy while making warfare even more brutal for everyone else. Class warfare in the most literal sense. And let's talk about what being held for ransom did to you psychologically. You're imprisoned, possibly in terrible conditions, separated from your family, watching your financial situation collapse with no clear timeline for release. Some prisoners were held for years while ransom was negotiated. The psychological toll was immense. Depression, anxiety, and what we'd now recognize as PTSD were common among ransomed knights. Some never fully recovered from the experience. King John II of France was captured at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356 and held in England for 4 years while his enormous ransom was negotiated. Even though he was treated relatively well, he was a king after all. The experience clearly affected him. When he returned to France briefly and then had to go back to England, because the ransom terms weren't met, he reportedly became despondent and ill, dying in English captivity in 1364. Being a hostage, even a well-treated one, is traumatic. And not all prisoners were well-treated. There are accounts of prisoners being kept in actual dungeons, in chains, in darkness, with minimal food, as pressure tactics to speed up ransom payment. Some developed serious health problems from their imprisonment that affected them for the rest of their lives. And even after you were ransomed and released, you weren't free from the system. You now had to actually pay the ransom, which often meant selling lands, taking out loans, or relying on your lord or family to cover the cost. This would leave you in debt, possibly for the rest of your life. Some knights never recovered financially from a single ransom. Their families would be impoverished, their lands sold off, their status diminished, all because they did their duty and fought in battle. The ransom system was supposed to be a civilized alternative to killing captured enemies. In reality, it was a form of financial warfare that could be just as destructive as physical combat, just slower and more insidious. So add that to the list of reasons why being a knight sucked. At any moment in battle, you could be captured and held for a ransom that would financially devastate your family for generations. Fun times. Chapter 7. The Feudal Obligations. Or, you don't actually own anything. Now let's talk about the feudal system, because this is where things get really fun. See, even if you were a knight with lands and titles, you didn't actually own any of it in the way we think of ownership today. Everything was conditional, and those conditions could destroy your life. The feudal system was essentially a pyramid scheme of land ownership and military obligation. At the top was the king, who theoretically owned all the land in the kingdom. He would grant land to his most important nobles, dukes, earls, counts, in exchange for their loyalty and military service. Those nobles would then grant portions of their land to lesser nobles, barons, knights, in exchange for their loyalty and military service, and so on down the chain. As a knight, you probably held your land from a higher noble, who held it from someone higher, who held it from the king, and every link in that chain came with obligations. The most obvious obligation was military service. You owed your lord a certain number of days of military service per year, typically 40 days, as we mentioned earlier. During those 40 days, you had to show up with your equipment, your horse, and possibly additional soldiers, if you were required to provide them, and fight wherever your lord commanded. Refuse, and you could lose your lands, just like that. Your lord could declare you in breach of your feudal obligations and confiscate everything you had. Now, 40 days might not sound too bad, but remember, those 40 days don't include travel time to and from wherever the fighting is. A campaign might be hundreds of miles away. You might spend weeks traveling to the muster point, serve your 40 days, then spend weeks traveling home. That's months away from your estate. And during that time, who's managing your lands? Hopefully you had a competent steward or family member, but they're not you. Things would inevitably be handled less efficiently in your absence. Oh, and those 40 days? They were at your expense. Your lord wasn't paying for your equipment, your horse, your food, or your travel. All of that came out of your pocket. You were providing free military service and paying for the privilege. If your lord needed you for longer than 40 days, which was common during major wars, he might pay you for the additional time. But the rates were often not enough to cover your actual costs, and you couldn't refuse without risking your lands. But military service was just the beginning. Of your obligations, you also owed various payments and fees to your lord, and these could be extensive and arbitrary. There was relief, essentially an inheritance tax. When you inherited land from your father, you had to pay your lord a fee, typically equivalent to 1 year's income from that land, before you could take possession. This meant that when your father died, you immediately went into debt or had to scramble to raise a huge sum of money just to keep what was supposedly yours. There was aid, payments you owed your lord for special occasions. If your lord's eldest son was knighted, you paid. If your lord's eldest daughter got married, you paid. If your lord was captured and needed ransom, you paid. These weren't small amounts either. They could be substantial portions of your annual income. There was wardship. If you died and left underage heirs, your lord took control of your lands until your heirs came of age. During that time, he collected all the income from those lands. Theoretically, he was supposed to use some of that income to care for and educate your children. In practice, many lords just pocketed the money and provided minimal care, and your lord had the right to arrange marriages for your children if you died while they were young. This gave him enormous power over your family's future. He might arrange advantageous marriages, or he might sell the marriage rights to the highest bidder, with no regard for your children's welfare. There was purveyance, the right of your lord and the king to requisition supplies from your estates for their household or army. In theory, they were supposed to pay fair prices. In practice, they often paid below market rates or just took things without payment. You couldn't refuse without risking punishment. And then there were all sorts of smaller obligations and customs that varied by region and by lord. You might owe labor services, days worked on your lord's lands. You might owe hospitality. You had to house and feed your lord and his retinue when they visited, which could be ruinously expensive. You might owe various goods, grain, livestock, wine, whatever your lord demanded. All of this meant that even though you were supposedly a landowner and a member of the nobility, you were actually caught in a web of obligations and payments that constantly drained your resources. And here's the thing, your lord could increase these obligations or invent new ones, and there wasn't much you could do about it. Sure, there were supposed to be customs and limits, but enforcement was sketchy at best. If your lord was powerful enough, he could pretty much do what he wanted. Some lords were reasonable and followed established customs. Others were rapacious, constantly squeezing their vassals for more money and service. And you couldn't just leave and find a better lord. You were tied to your land, and your land was tied to your lord. Complain too much, and you might find yourself accused of disloyalty. And disloyalty in the feudal system could mean losing everything. Your lands, your titles, possibly your life. There are numerous cases of knights who fell out of favor with their lords and were destroyed. Their lands were confiscated, they were exiled, their families were impoverished, all because they angered someone more powerful. And it wasn't just your immediate lord you had to worry about. Remember, there's a whole chain of lordship above you. The king could override your lord and make demands directly on you. Higher nobles could pressure your lord to pressure you. During civil wars or succession disputes, which were common in medieval Europe, You might find yourself caught between competing claimants, each demanding your loyalty and service. Support the wrong side, and you could lose everything if they lost. This happened constantly during conflicts like the Wars of the Roses in England or the various succession crises in France. Knights and nobles had to make agonizing political calculations, trying to guess which side would win, knowing that backing the losing side could mean total ruin. Some tried to hedge their bets, giving lukewarm support to multiple sides. Some tried to stay neutral. Neither strategy was safe. Everyone expected total loyalty, and anything less could be seen as betrayal. And let's talk about what happened when your lord rebelled against the king, because that happened fairly often in medieval politics. Powerful nobles would rebel, trying to extract concessions from the king or even overthrow him. As a vassal of a rebelling lord, you were expected to support your lord's rebellion, but that meant you were now rebelling against the king, which was treason. If the rebellion failed, you could be executed or lose everything, even if you were just following your feudal obligations to support your lord. So you were damned if you did, damned if you didn't. Support your lords. Rebellion and risk being executed for treason. Refuse to support your lord and lose your lands for breaking your feudal obligations. Some knights tried to navigate this by providing minimal support or finding excuses to avoid the fighting. Others genuinely supported their lord's rebellions and paid the price when they failed. The feudal system also created situations where you might have to fight against family members or close friends who owed allegiance to different lords. Brothers ended up on opposite sides of battles. Fathers fought against sons. Friendships were destroyed by conflicting feudal loyalties, and there was no real way out of the system. You couldn't just resign from being a knight and walk away from your obligations. Your lands came with duties, and those duties were hereditary. Your children would inherit the same obligations, trapped in the same system. Some knights, in desperation, would join crusades or enter monasteries as a way of escaping impossible feudal situations. At least on crusade or in a monastery, you weren't caught in the web of competing obligations and loyalties. Oh, and let's not forget that you had vassals of your own to manage. If you held enough land, you probably had knights or lesser nobles who owed you service, which meant you had to enforce their obligations while fulfilling your own. This made you both oppressor and oppressed, squeezing those below you while being squeezed by those above you. The stress of managing these relationships, demanding service from your vassals while trying to meet your lord's demands, was constant. And if your vassals failed to meet their obligations, it reflected badly on you. You were responsible for ensuring they provided their service. If they didn't show up for a military campaign, your lord would blame you, not them. So you had to be simultaneously subservient to those above you and authoritative to those below you, constantly performing a balancing act that could collapse at any moment. The feudal system was supposed to create a stable hierarchy of mutual obligations and protections. In practice, it created a nightmare of competing loyalties, financial exploitation, and constant political vulnerability, where one wrong move could destroy you and your family. You didn't own your land. You held it conditionally, and those conditions could change or be used against you at any time. You weren't really free. You were caught in a web of obligations that controlled every aspect of your life. So yeah, being a knight meant being trapped in a system where you were simultaneously nobility and prisoner, landowner and tenant, warrior and servant. The feudal system, it's complicated, and all the complications suck for you. Chapter 8, the Crusades, or religious warfare in the desert. All right, we need to talk about the Crusades, because when we discuss why being a medieval knight sucked, the Crusades are like a greatest hits compilation of everything awful about knighthood, all rolled into one catastrophic package and shipped off to the Middle East. Between 1095 and the late 1200s, European Christians launched multiple military campaigns to capture and hold Jerusalem and other sites in the Holy Land. These campaigns promised spiritual salvation, earthly glory, and material wealth. They delivered mostly death, disease, and financial ruin. Let's start with why knights went on crusade in the first place. The propaganda was compelling. Fight for God, save your soul. protect fellow Christians, and maybe get rich looting Muslim cities. The Pope promised that crusading would absolve you of your sins. For medieval people who genuinely feared hell, this was a huge draw. Plus, there was the social pressure. When the Pope calls for a crusade and all your fellow nobles are taking up the cross, refusing to go made you look cowardly and impious. Some knights genuinely believed in the cause. Others went because they felt they had no choice socially. And then there were the practical considerations. Some knights saw crusading as an escape from debts, feudal obligations, or political problems at home. Crusaders were supposed to be under church protection, meaning creditors couldn't seize their property while they were gone. For knights drowning in debt, this was appealing. Others were younger sons with no inheritance prospects, hoping to carve out lands and wealth in the east. The promise was that there were kingdoms to be won in the Holy Land for those brave enough to take them. So off they went, and reality hit them like a mace to the face. First problem, getting there. The Holy Land was thousands of miles from Western Europe. You had two main options: go by land or go by sea. Both were terrible. The land route meant marching through the Byzantine Empire and then Anatolia into Syria and Palestine. This journey could take a year or more. You'd be traveling through territories that range from friendly to actively hostile, dealing with unfamiliar terrain, language barriers, and constant threats of ambush. The First Crusade's march through Anatolia was a nightmare. The Crusaders, wearing their heavy European armor, marched through a desert climate they were utterly unprepared for. Heat exhaustion killed more Crusaders than Turkish arrows did. Water sources were scarce. Supply lines were non-existent. Knights would watch their horses die of thirst and exhaustion, then have to continue on foot, carrying their armor because they couldn't afford to abandon it. Some knights died of dehydration while still wearing armor designed for European weather, and the Turkish mounted archers who harassed the column, they were fighting on their home territory with tactics specifically designed to counter heavy cavalry. They'd shoot arrows from a distance, retreat when the Crusaders charged, then come back and shoot more arrows. The Crusaders couldn't catch them and couldn't effectively fight back. Imagine spending months marching through a desert, watching your companions die of thirst and disease, getting shot at by enemies you can't reach, all before you even get to the actual crusade. The sea route wasn't better. Mediterranean shipping in the medieval period was expensive and dangerous. You'd be crammed into a ship with hundreds of other people, horses, and supplies. Seasickness was universal. Storms could sink ships. Pirates were a constant threat. And the cost. Passage to the Holy Land could cost as much as multiple years of a knight's income. Some knights had to sell or mortgage their lands just to pay for passage. They were going into debt before they even left Europe, gambling that they'd make enough money in the Holy Land to pay it back. Many didn't. Some crusaders bankrupted their families just getting to the Middle East. Assuming you survived the journey, you now had to deal with actually fighting in the Holy Land. And this is where things got really bad. European armor and tactics were designed for European warfare. Heavy cavalry charges, plate armor, close quarters combat. All of this worked in European battles. In the Middle Eastern desert, not so much. That armor that was already a nightmare in European summer heat, now try wearing it in temperatures that routinely exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Knights would literally cook inside their armor. Heat stroke was rampant. Some crusaders died without ever seeing combat, just from heat exposure. Water was scarce and often contaminated. Dysentery swept through crusader camps, killing more men than battles did. Medieval people had no understanding of germ theory, so they couldn't prevent the spread of disease. One chronicler of the Third Crusade estimated that for every crusader who died in battle, 10 died of disease. Those might not be accurate numbers, but they convey the scale of the problem. Disease was the real killer. And the diseases weren't just dysentery. There was typhoid, typhus, malaria, scurvy from vitamin deficiencies, various parasitic infections, and diseases European crusaders had never encountered before. and had no immunity to. Medical care was primitive, even by medieval standards. Battlefield surgery in the desert, with no way to prevent infection, was basically a death sentence. Even minor wounds could become infected and kill you within days. The enemy forces were also fighting on their home territory, with tactics adapted to the environment. Muslim armies used light cavalry, composite bows, and hit-and-run tactics that confounded European knights trained for set-piece battles. At the Battle of Hattin in 1187, Saladin deliberately led the Crusader army away from water sources in the summer heat. The Crusaders, already exhausted and dehydrated, were surrounded and slaughtered. Thousands of knights were killed or captured. The Kingdom of Jerusalem effectively collapsed. The captured knights were faced with a choice: convert to Islam or be executed. Some converted, others refused and were killed. Those who were ransomed faced the same financial devastation we discussed earlier, except now the ransom had to be paid across thousands of miles of distance and multiple currencies. But let's say you survived battles and disease. Let's say you actually successfully participated in capturing a city. Now came the looting and the atrocities. When Crusader armies captured cities, what followed was often horrific. The sack of Jerusalem in 1099 was particularly brutal. Crusaders massacred thousands of Muslims and Jews, including non-combatants. Contemporary chroniclers described blood running in the streets ankle-deep. Whether you participated in these atrocities or just witnessed them, the psychological impact would have been severe. Remember, many Crusaders genuinely believed they were doing God's work. Reconciling that belief with the reality of what crusading involved was psychologically devastating for some. And the loot that was supposed to make you rich, most of it went to the leaders. Common knights got relatively little, and what they got, they often had to spend on replacing equipment, buying food and water, or paying for medical care. For those crusaders who actually settled in the Crusader states, the kingdoms established in the Holy Land, life was a constant struggle. You were a tiny Christian minority, surrounded by a much larger Muslim population, under constant threat of attack, dealing with unfamiliar diseases and climate, cut off from home by thousands of miles. The Crusader states were in a perpetual state of siege mentality. Everyone was paranoid about spies, betrayal, and attack. The political situation was Byzantine in its complexity, with constant infighting among Christian factions, even while facing external Muslim threats. And maintaining these states required constant reinforcement from Europe, which meant a steady stream of new crusaders, arriving, each wave bringing their own problems, cultural misunderstandings, and conflicts with the established Crusader nobility. Some knights spent decades in the Holy Land, never able to return home, fighting in a war that never seemed to end. They'd watch friends die of disease and battle, witness atrocities that haunted them, and slowly realize that the glorious crusade they'd imagined was actually a grinding, brutal struggle for survival in a hostile environment. Even crusades that didn't go to the Holy Land were terrible. The Fourth Crusade famously never even made it to Muslim territories. Instead, the Crusaders ended up sacking Constantinople, a Christian city, in 1204. Christian Crusaders killing other Christians and looting one of the greatest Christian cities in the world. The Pope excommunicated the Crusaders, but the damage was done. The psychological impact of these campaigns was severe. Many returning Crusaders suffered from what we now recognize as PTSD. They'd seen and done things that haunted them. Some became withdrawn and bitter. Others tried to find meaning in their suffering by joining military religious orders or becoming more devout. Some never came home at all. They died in battle, died of disease, died on the journey, or chose to stay in the East rather than face the ruin they'd left behind in Europe. And for what? The Crusades ultimately failed in their primary objective. Jerusalem was captured, lost, briefly recaptured, and lost again. The Crusader states slowly collapsed. By the end of the 13th century, the Christian presence in the Holy Land had been almost entirely eliminated. Thousands of knights had died, tens of thousands had been bankrupted, countless atrocities had been committed, and in the end, it accomplished essentially nothing, except deepening the hostility between Christian and Muslim worlds. So if you were a knight during the crusading era, you faced enormous pressure to participate in a military campaign that would take you thousands of miles from home, bankrupt you financially, possibly kill you through disease or combat, traumatize you psychologically, and even if you survived, probably wouldn't achieve its stated objectives. The Crusades, all the worst parts of being a knight, but now with exotic diseases and desert heat. Chapter 9. The Political Nightmare, or Court Intrigue Will Destroy You. So we've covered the physical dangers, the financial burdens, and the military horrors of being a knight. But we haven't yet fully addressed one of the most insidious aspects of medieval knighthood, the politics. Because being a knight wasn't just about fighting, it was about navigating a treacherous political landscape where one misstep could destroy your career, your family, and your life. Medieval courts were cesspools of intrigue, backstabbing, and power struggles. And as a knight, you were expected to participate in this system while also somehow maintaining your honor and integrity. Good luck with that. Let's start with the basics. Patronage. Your success as a knight depended heavily on having the favor of powerful nobles, and ideally the king. Without patronage, you were nobody. With it, you could rise to great heights. But gaining and keeping patronage required constant performance. And we're not talking about military performance. We're talking about social and political performance. You had to attend court regularly, which meant traveling to wherever your lord was holding court and spending days or weeks away from your own estates. During this time, you had to dress impressively, give gifts, make witty conversation, flatter the right people, and generally be entertaining and useful. This cost money, lots of money. Court dress was expensive. Gifts to your lord and other nobles were expensive. Maintaining a household that could travel to court was expensive. And while you were at court, your estates were generating less income because you weren't there to manage them. So you were spending money to gain favor that might or might not result in benefits, that might or might not cover your costs. It was a gamble, and many knights lost, but refused to participate in court life, and you'd be forgotten. Out of sight, out of mind. Your rivals would be there, whispering in your lord's ear, positioning themselves for advantages while you were absent. And the social dynamics of court were brutal. Every interaction was weighted with significance. Who you talked to, who you sat next to at feasts, who you danced with, who you complimented. All of it was observed and interpreted. Make a joke that offends the wrong person. That could create an enemy who would spend years undermining you. Fail to laugh at your lord's terrible joke, he might perceive that as disrespect. Give a gift that's too cheap. You look poor or stingy, too expensive. You look like you're trying to buy favor, or worse, like you have money when you claim poverty to avoid taxes. It was an endless minefield of social expectations and unwritten rules, and you were expected to navigate it perfectly while also being ready to go fight in a war at a moment's notice. Oh, and let's talk about factions. Medieval courts were divided into competing factions, usually centered around powerful nobles or royal family members. As a knight, you had to choose which faction to align with, and this choice could make or break you. Choose the winning faction, and you might be rewarded with lands, titles, and positions. Choose the losing faction, and you could lose everything when they fell from power. The problem was that you often had to choose before it was clear who would win. Political fortunes shifted constantly. Today's favorite courtier could be tomorrow's disgraced exile. The noble who seemed to have the king's ear might suddenly fall from favor for reasons you didn't even know about. Some knights tried to play both sides, maintaining connections with multiple factions. This was risky. If you were caught, everyone would see you as an untrustworthy opportunist. But refusing to pick a side was also dangerous, as it meant you had no powerful protectors when conflicts arose. And conflicts arose constantly. Medieval courts were hotbeds of disputes over lands, over titles, over perceived insults, over marriages, over everything imaginable. As a knight, you'd often be dragged into these disputes, whether you wanted to be or not. Your lord is in a dispute with another noble. You're expected to support your lord, which means making an enemy of the other noble and all their allies. Your family has an old feud with another family. You're expected to continue that feud, even if it's over something that happened generations ago and has nothing to do with you personally. Some of these disputes were settled through legal proceedings in the king's court, which meant expensive lawyers, bribes to court officials, and months or years of legal wrangling. Others were settled through violence, either open warfare or assassinations. And yes, political assassination was definitely a thing in medieval courts. Rivals would be poisoned, ambushed on the road, or killed in accidents that were anything but accidental. As a knight involved in court politics, you had to constantly watch your back, literally. Some knights employed food tasters to check for poison. Others traveled with armed escorts at all times. Paranoia was a survival skill, but the political dangers weren't just from rivals. They could come from the king himself. Medieval monarchs were often paranoid about threats to their power, and they could turn on their own supporters with terrifying speed. A king might elevate you one day, giving you lands and honors, then suspect you of treason the next day and have you executed. The line between being a trusted advisor and a suspected traitor was razor thin and could shift without warning. Henry II of England had his friend and Archbishop Thomas Becket murdered in 1170 after a political dispute. Edward II of England turned on many of his former favorites, having them executed or exiled. These weren't isolated incidents. Medieval history is full of kings destroying their own supporters. And once a king turned against you, there was often no defense. Treason trials were rigged, evidence was fabricated, confessions were tortured out of you. Even if you were completely innocent, you might be destroyed simply because the king found it politically convenient. The smart move was to keep a low profile and avoid attracting too much attention, either positive or negative. But that wasn't really an option for knights, who were expected to seek glory and advancement. So you were trapped. You had to be ambitious and visible enough to gain rewards, but not so ambitious and visible that you became a threat. It was an impossible balance, and many knights failed to maintain it. Now let's talk about marriage politics, because this was another area where knights had very little control over their own lives. Marriages among the nobility were political arrangements, pure and simple. Your marriage would be arranged to benefit your family, your lord, or both. Your personal preferences didn't matter. Love matches were the exception, not the rule. As a knight, you might be ordered to marry someone to seal an alliance, settle a dispute, or gain strategic lands. Your bride might be someone you'd never met, from a family you disliked, or even from a foreign country where you didn't speak the language, and you couldn't refuse without serious consequences. Marriage was too important a political tool. Refusing an advantageous match could be seen as disloyalty to your lord or family. So you'd marry a stranger, potentially move to unfamiliar territory, and be expected to produce heirs to continue the political alliance. And if the marriage failed to produce children, or produced only daughters, in a system that heavily favored male heirs, that was your problem to deal with. Some knights were fortunate and ended up in marriages that became genuinely affectionate partnerships. Others spent their lives in cold, resentful relationships with spouses they had nothing in common with except political necessity. And here's a fun complication. Marriage didn't end your obligation to serve your lord militarily. You might be newlywed or have a pregnant wife at home, but if your lord called for military service, you went. Your wife's preferences, your desire to be present for your children's births, your family obligations, none of that mattered as much as your feudal duties. Some knights barely knew their own children because they were constantly away at war or at court. Their wives effectively raised the children alone while managing the estates, and the knights would return occasionally as strangers in their own homes. This created its own set of problems. Children growing up without fathers, wives managing estates, and wielding power in their husband's absence, and then tensions when the husband returned and tried to reassert authority in a household that had learned to function without him. The politics of knighthood could destroy you just as surely as any battle, just more slowly and with more betrayal involved. Chapter 10: The Hygiene Horror, or Everything Smells Bad Including You. Let's talk about something that doesn't get enough attention when we discuss medieval life: the sheer, overwhelming grossness of everyday existence. Because if all the violence and political intrigue didn't get you, the filth might. We touched on this briefly, but it deserves its own deep dive, because the hygiene situation in medieval times was catastrophically bad in ways that would make a modern person physically ill. Let's start with your body. As mentioned, bathing was infrequent, maybe once a month if you were wealthy and conscientious, less often if you weren't. Between baths, you were just accumulating sweat, dirt, dead skin, and oils. Your skin would develop a layer of grime. Your hair would become greasy and matted. And remember those parasites we mentioned? Lice absolutely loved unwashed hair and bodies. Head lice, body lice. They were constant companions for medieval people of all classes. The itching was relentless. Medieval people would scratch constantly, leaving marks and sometimes breaking skin, which could then become infected. Some people developed chronic skin conditions from the combination of dirt, parasites, and constant scratching. And your clothes absorbed all of this funk. Medieval people wore wool and linen, which would soak up sweat and oils. Washing clothes was labor-intensive and infrequent, so your clothing was probably at least slightly rancid most of the time. Undergarments helped. Linen shifts or brays would absorb the worst of the body oils and could be washed more frequently than outer garments. But more frequently still meant maybe once a week if you were diligent, less often if you weren't. Now let's talk about your mouth. Without modern dental hygiene, your breath was probably terrible. Food particles would rot between your teeth. Gums would become inflamed and infected. Teeth would decay. The medieval diet, heavy on bread and meat, with limited fruits and vegetables, was not great for oral health. Grain ground on stone mills would contain tiny particles of grit that would wear down tooth enamel. Sugar was rare for most people, which actually helped, but the overall oral hygiene situation was still dire. By middle age, many people had significant tooth decay, abscesses, and missing teeth. The pain could be constant, and the smell from rotting teeth and infected gums would be nauseating. Medieval people tried to address this with various remedies: chewing herbs, rinsing with wine or vinegar, picking at teeth with small sticks. But these did little to prevent the underlying problems. And then there was the matter of bodily waste. We've talked about garderobes and chamber pots, but let's really dig into what this meant for daily life. Castle garderobes emptied into moats or cesspits. This meant that the moat, the water feature surrounding your castle, was partially filled with human waste. The smell, especially in summer, would be overwhelming. Cesspits would be dug beneath garderobes and periodically emptied by workers called gong farmers, who had possibly the worst job in medieval society. They'd shovel out human waste and haul it away, usually at night. The smell during this process would permeate the entire castle. Some waste was used as fertilizer for fields, which meant that agricultural areas near castles also smelled of human waste, especially after fresh application. Chamber pots, as mentioned, would be kept in bedchambers and emptied by servants, but emptying them meant carrying pots of waste through the castle to wherever they could be disposed of. Spills happened, smells lingered, and there was no toilet paper. Medieval people used various materials: cloth scraps, moss, leaves, hay, or sometimes just their hands, and then washed, hopefully. The cloth scraps might be washed and reused, or they might not be. Streets in medieval towns were often open sewers. People would throw waste from their windows into the streets below. Animal waste from horses, dogs, pigs, and other livestock mixed with human waste, rotting food, and general garbage. Walking through a medieval town meant wading through filth. Your shoes and the hem of your clothing would be constantly dirty. The smell would be inescapable. Rain would wash some of this into streams and rivers, which were also used as sources of drinking water downstream. Medieval people didn't understand water contamination, so they drink from rivers that were effectively sewage outlets. This led to constant problems with waterborne diseases, dysentery, typhoid, cholera, and others. People would get sick, not understand why, and the cycle would continue. Inside castles and homes, rushes or straw would be scattered on floors to provide insulation and absorb spills. These rushes would accumulate food scraps, spilled drinks, tracked in mud and waste, and would rarely be completely replaced, just fresh rushes added on top. The bottom layer of rushes could be months or years old, composting into a disgusting mat of rotted organic material, hosting insects, rodents, and who knows what else. Walking on these floors meant walking on a layer of accumulated filth. Dogs were common in castles and homes, and they'd urinate and defecate wherever they pleased. Some of it would be cleaned up, but not all. The rushes absorbed dog waste, along with everything else. Food preparation and storage were also hygiene nightmares. Kitchens had open fires, minimal ventilation, and attracted pests. Rats and mice would get into food stores. Insects would contaminate food. Proper food storage was difficult with medieval technology. Meat would be preserved by salting or smoking, processes that helped but didn't eliminate the risk of spoilage. Fresh meat would be used quickly because it would rot in days without refrigeration. You could smell when meat was starting to turn, and people would use heavy spicing to mask the taste of slightly spoiled food. Milk and dairy products would sour quickly. Water could be contaminated. Ale and wine were actually safer drinks than water in many cases, which is why even children drank weak ale regularly. The animals that shared living spaces with humans, dogs, cats, sometimes chickens or other livestock in peasant homes, added their own contributions to the overall filth. Animal hair, dander, fleas, ticks, and waste were just part of the indoor environment, and we haven't even discussed disease and mortality in terms of their effect on hygiene. When people died, and they died frequently, the body would be laid out in the home before burial. In warm weather, decomposition would begin quickly, creating smells and attracting insects. Burials might be delayed due to various reasons: bad weather, frozen ground in winter, lack of funds for proper burial, political complications. Bodies might be in homes for days before burial, decomposing all the while. During plague outbreaks, bodies would pile up faster than they could be buried, creating mass graves and extreme public health hazards that medieval people had no way to properly address. Hospitals and infirmaries, run by religious orders, tried to care for the sick, but with no understanding of germ theory or proper sanitation, they often became places where diseases spread. Patients with different illnesses would be in the same rooms, sharing air, and sometimes bedding. Medical treatments often involved bloodletting, which would be done with reused instruments that weren't properly sterilized. Surgeries, when performed, were done without anesthesia, antiseptics, or understanding of infection control. Surgical instruments would be used on multiple patients without proper cleaning. Post-surgical infection was extremely common and often fatal. The smell of sickness, infected wounds, gangrene, various diseases would permeate medical facilities. Visitors would notice the smell from outside the building. For knights specifically, the hygiene problems were compounded by their military activities. After battle, you'd be covered in blood, sweat, possibly urine, and feces from yourself or others, and various bodily fluids from wounds. Your armor would need to be cleaned, but getting all the blood and gore out of the joints and crevices was nearly impossible. The padding underneath would be soaked with blood and sweat. Even with cleaning, armor retained smells. Campaign life meant weeks or months without proper bathing. Facilities. You'd be sleeping in tents or rough shelters, dealing with mud, rain, and outdoor latrines that were just trenches in the ground. Thousands of soldiers in close quarters with inadequate sanitation meant that military camps were cesspools of filth and disease. Latrines would overflow. Waste would contaminate water sources. Disease would spread through camps, killing more soldiers than combat did. And after all of this, when you returned home, you'd carry the accumulated filth and possibly diseases back with you, spreading them to your household and community. The simple fact was that medieval people lived in a state that we would consider intolerably filthy, and they knew it was unpleasant. They had working noses and could smell the stench. They could feel the discomfort of dirty skin and clothes. They could see the filth around them, but they largely accepted it as unavoidable because with medieval technology and understanding, it mostly was unavoidable. They didn't know about bacteria or viruses. They didn't have running water, sewage systems, or effective sanitation. So they lived with the filth, and it killed them. Infection from poor hygiene, waterborne diseases, parasite-borne illnesses, and general sickness from living in unsanitary conditions were major causes of death throughout the medieval period. Being a knight meant living in this same filthy world, just with more expensive clothes that still smelled bad, better food that could still be contaminated, and nicer castles that still had cesspits beneath them. The glamorous life of a medieval knight. You smell terrible. Everyone around you smells terrible. Everything smells terrible. And there's not much you can do about it except try not to think about it too hard. Chapter 11. The Medical Nightmare, or treatment worse than disease. We've touched on medieval medicine a bit, but we really need to dig into just how horrifying medical care was in the Middle Ages, because if you got sick or injured as a knight, and you probably would, the cure might be worse than the problem. Let's start with the basic medical theory of the time, the four humors. Medieval doctors believed that the body contained four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that health depended on keeping these in balance. This was completely wrong, but it was the foundation of all medieval medicine. When you got sick, doctors would try to rebalance your humors through various means, none of which actually worked because the entire premise was false. The most common treatment was bloodletting. Feeling feverish? They'd bleed you. Infected wound? More bleeding. Headache? Definitely bleeding. The idea was that you had too much blood, and removing some would restore balance. They'd cut open a vein and let blood drain into a bowl, sometimes removing pints of blood from already weakened patients. Or they'd use leeches, which would attach to your skin and suck blood until they were engorged. For someone already sick or injured, losing significant amounts of blood often made things worse. Patients would become weak, dizzy, and more vulnerable to infection. Some died from the bloodletting itself, though doctors would usually attribute this to the original illness rather than their treatment. Another popular treatment was purging, making you vomit or giving you powerful laxatives to expel the bad humors from your body. The substances used were often toxic and would cause violent vomiting and diarrhea, leaving you dehydrated and exhausted. Some purging medicines were based on mercury or other heavy metals that were literally poisoning you. Patients would suffer terrible side effects, but doctors would interpret this as the medicine working to drive out the illness. Then there were poultices and ointments made from various substances, animal fats, herbs, minerals, and sometimes truly bizarre ingredients. Some of these were harmless, some had mild beneficial effects, and some were actively harmful. Popular ingredients included things like ground up precious stones, powdered mummy, yes, actual Egyptian mummies ground into powder, animal dung, and various toxic plants. The logic was often sympathetic magic, rather than any understanding of medicine. If a plant looked like a body part, it must be good for that body part. For infected wounds, doctors might apply hot irons to cauterize them, burning the flesh to seal it. This was incredibly painful. Remember, no anesthesia, and often made infections worse rather than better. Amputation was the standard treatment for badly injured or infected limbs. The procedure involved sawing through bone with a handsaw while the patient was held down by several strong men. The patient would be conscious and feeling everything, possibly with some alcohol to dull the pain slightly. The survival rate for amputations was maybe 50 to 50 at best. Many patients died from shock during the procedure. Others died from infection afterward, since the surgical instruments and the wound itself weren't kept clean by modern standards. If you survived the amputation, you'd be left disabled in a world with no wheelchairs, prosthetics that were crude at best, and no social support systems for disabled people. Your knightly career was over, and your ability to manage your estates and provide for your family was severely compromised. Broken bones were set by manipulating them back into place, again without anesthesia, then immobilizing the limb with splints. If the bone was set incorrectly or became infected, you might end up with a permanently deformed or useless limb. Head injuries, which knights suffered frequently, were sometimes treated with trepanation, drilling or cutting holes in the skull to release pressure or let evil spirits out. This incredibly risky procedure had a high mortality rate and could cause brain damage even if you survived. For internal problems that couldn't be seen, doctors would diagnose based on examining urine, feeling the pulse, and observing symptoms. Their interpretations were based on humor theory and astrology rather than actual medical knowledge, so diagnoses were often completely wrong. They might prescribe medicines that did nothing for your actual condition while ignoring treatments that might have helped. Or they might prescribe actively harmful treatments that made you worse. Pain management was primitive. Alcohol could dull pain somewhat. Opium-based preparations existed, but were expensive and not widely available. Mostly you just had to endure pain until it went away or you died. Chronic pain from old injuries, arthritis, dental problems, and other conditions was just something you lived with. There was no effective treatment. Knights would suffer from old battlefield injuries for decades with constant pain and limited mobility, and medicine could offer them nothing. And let's talk about what happened during epidemics, because disease outbreaks were common and devastating. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the 14th century, killed roughly 1/3 of the population. Medieval medicine was completely helpless against it. Doctors tried bloodletting, purging, prayers, burning aromatic herbs. Nothing worked. Some people turned to flagellation, whipping themselves to appease God's wrath. Others blamed minorities, particularly Jews, leading to pogroms and massacres. The medical and social response to plague was often as destructive as the disease itself. Knights weren't immune to plague. Your wealth and status couldn't protect you from a disease that killed indiscriminately. If you caught plague, you'd likely die within days, suffering from painful swellings, fever, and delirium, while doctors stood by helplessly or fled to avoid infection themselves. Other diseases were equally terrifying. Leprosy would cause progressive disfigurement and disability, and lepers were exiled from society, forced to live in isolated leper colonies. If you developed leprosy, your life as you knew it was over. Ergotism, caused by eating grain, infected with a fungus, would cause hallucinations, convulsions, and gangrene. Limbs would turn black and fall off. People experiencing ergotism were sometimes thought to be possessed by demons. Even common illnesses could be deadly without effective treatment. A bad case of influenza could kill you. Pneumonia was often fatal. Infections from minor wounds could spread and kill you within days, and there was no concept of sterilization or germ theory. Doctors might treat multiple patients without washing their hands, spreading disease from one to another. Surgical instruments were wiped off but not truly cleaned. Bandages might be reused. The very act of seeking medical care could expose you to more diseases and infections. Hospitals, while well-intentioned, were often breeding grounds for illness. Childbirth was particularly dangerous for women, with high mortality rates for both mothers and babies. But since this is about knights, let's focus on how this affected you. Your wife might die in childbirth, leaving you with motherless children and political complications if the marriage had been arranged for strategic purposes. You might remarry quickly, possibly to a woman you didn't know, starting the cycle again. Some knights lost multiple wives to childbirth complications over their lifetimes. Your own mother might have died, giving birth to you or a sibling. maternal mortality was common enough that many children grew up without mothers, raised by stepmothers, relatives, or servants, and infant mortality was staggeringly high. You might father a dozen children and see half of them die before age 5 from diseases that modern medicine can easily prevent or treat. The emotional toll of repeatedly losing children was immense. Medieval people developed coping mechanisms for this constant loss: religious faith, acceptance of death as God's will, emotional distance from infants until they'd survived the most dangerous early years. But that didn't make the losses less painful. For knights specifically, injuries from combat and tournaments would accumulate over a lifetime. By middle age, you'd likely have a collection of old injuries that caused chronic pain and limited mobility. Old sword wounds that never healed quite right. Broken bones that set poorly. Concussion damage causing headaches, dizziness, and cognitive problems. Joint damage from the constant wear of armor in combat. Partial hearing loss from all the noise of battle. And medieval medicine could do essentially nothing about any of this. You'd just have to live with constant pain and declining physical function, knowing that your martial career was slowly ending as your body broke down. Some knights became dependent on alcohol or opium preparations to manage pain, developing addictions that created new problems while failing to solve the original ones. Others became bitter and angry, their personalities warped by chronic pain and the frustration of bodies that no longer worked as they once did. The combination of physical trauma, inadequate medical care, poor nutrition, and generally unhealthy living conditions meant that knights often aged poorly. A knight in his 40s might be physically incapacitated, looking and feeling decades older than his actual age. Life expectancy for those who survived childhood was maybe 50 to 60 years, and many knights didn't make it that long. Battle, disease, accidents, and accumulated health problems would kill you well before old age. And when you died, there was no life insurance, no pension plans, nothing to ensure your family was provided for, except whatever arrangements you'd made yourself. If you died in debt, which many knights did, your family might lose everything. So add medical care to the list of horrors. When you got sick or injured, the treatments would likely make you worse. There was no effective pain management, and you'd probably die from things that would be easily treatable today. Medieval medicine, trying to help, mostly making things worse. Chapter 12, the legacy problem, or your children inherit your nightmare. Let's talk about something that doesn't get enough attention. Being a knight wasn't just ruining your life, it was setting up your children to have terrible lives too. The whole system was hereditary, meaning the nightmare passed from generation to generation. If you were a knight, your sons were expected to become knights. This wasn't really a choice, it was social and familial obligation. Your eldest son would inherit your lands and titles, and with them, all the obligations and expenses we've discussed. Your younger sons? They were in an even worse position. In most of Europe, inheritance followed primogeniture. The eldest son got everything, or at least the bulk of the estate. Younger sons got little or nothing. This created a class of landless knights with the expensive training and social expectations of nobility, but without the income to support that lifestyle. These younger sons had limited options. They could enter the church, which was respectable, but meant giving up the knightly life and any chance of marriage or legitimate children. Some genuinely wanted religious vocations. Others were pressured into it. They could try to marry wealthy heiresses, which was competitive and not always successful. Many heiresses were already spoken for through arranged marriages, and you'd be competing with other landless knights for the few opportunities available. They could become household knights in service to greater lords, essentially permanent employees with some status, but little independence and no lands of their own. They could become mercenaries, selling their martial skills to whoever would pay. This was dangerous, morally questionable, and socially looked down upon, even though it was economically necessary for many. Or they could join crusades or other military ventures, hoping to win lands and wealth through conquest. As we've discussed, this rarely worked out well. Basically, if you were a younger son, you had all the expensive training and social expectations of knighthood with none of the economic support system. You were set up to struggle financially for your entire life, and this wasn't something you could opt out of. Your father had spent years and significant money training you as a knight. Family honor demanded you uphold the knightly tradition. Social pressure from your class was intense. Some younger sons must have looked at their prospects and thought, "This is terrible. I don't want this life." But their options for doing anything else were extremely limited. Medieval society was rigid, and changing social classes or occupations was difficult or impossible. For your daughters, the situation was different but no better. As a knight's daughter, you'd be used as a political asset, married off to seal alliances or gain advantages for your family. Your personal preferences about who you married or whether you wanted to marry at all were largely irrelevant. You were expected to accept whatever match your father or guardian arranged. Some matches worked out well, with partners who came to care for each other. Others were disasters, forced marriages to much older men, to cruel men, to men from enemy families, where the marriage was supposed to create peace, but just created intimate proximity to someone you hated. And once married, women faced the dangers of repeated childbirth in an era with no effective medical care and high maternal mortality. Some women had a dozen or more pregnancies over their reproductive years, with each one potentially fatal. The social and emotional toll on children of knights was also significant. As we discussed, boys were sent away from home at age 7 to train as pages. This meant you barely knew your father, who was often away at war, court, or managing distant estates. You were separated from your mother and siblings at a young age, sent to live with strangers. You experienced harsh discipline, physical punishment, and the trauma of medieval training methods. You were expected to suppress emotions and develop a warrior mentality from childhood. The psychological impact of this upbringing was severe for many. You'd grow up with attachment issues, difficulty forming emotional connections, and possibly a perpetuation of the harsh treatment you'd received onto your own children and pages when you became a knight. Some children thrived in this system. They were naturally suited to the martial life, formed strong bonds with their mentors and fellow pages, and genuinely enjoyed the training. But others were psychologically damaged by it, becoming the medieval equivalent of traumatized child soldiers. And if you died while your children were young, which was common given the dangerous life of a knight, they'd become wards of your lord, who would control their inheritance and arrange their marriages. Some lords were responsible guardians who protected their ward's interests. Others exploited wardship, draining estates of income, and arranging marriages that benefited the guardian rather than the ward. Your children might grow up seeing their inheritance mismanaged, watching as the lands and wealth you'd struggled to maintain were squandered by a guardian who didn't care about your family's welfare. When they came of age and finally took control of their inheritance, they might find it severely depleted, with debts accumulated, lands sold off, and the estate in disarray. They'd start their adult lives at a disadvantage, trying to rebuild what should have been theirs all along. The cycle of debt and financial pressure was often hereditary. If you died in debt, which many knights did, those debts would pass to your heir. Your son would inherit not just your lands and titles, but also your creditors. He'd start his career as a knight, already in debt, already behind, already struggling, and he'd probably pass similar problems to his own children, generation after generation, trapped in a cycle of financial struggle. The political consequences of your choices would also affect your children. If you backed the wrong side in a civil war or fell out of favor with your lord, your family might be tainted by association for generations. Your children might find themselves excluded from opportunities, suspected of disloyalty, or targeted by your enemies even decades after your death. Family feuds could persist for generations, with children and grandchildren continuing conflicts they had no personal stake in. And the physical consequences of knightly life could be hereditary too. The lead poisoning from drinking wine out of lead vessels, the inbreeding common among noble families. since you married within your class and the pool of eligible partners was limited. And the general health problems of medieval life could lead to genetic issues in subsequent generations. Some noble families showed signs of hereditary health problems, hemophilia, mental illness, physical deformities, that were exacerbated by inbreeding and poor understanding of genetics. Your children might inherit not just your lands and titles, but also your health problems, your enemies, your debts, and your impossible position in a system designed to extract maximum service and resources while providing minimal support. And they'd have no choice but to continue the cycle, because that's what being born into the knightly class meant. Your legacy was trapping your descendants in the same nightmare you'd endured. Some knights must have recognized this and felt guilty about what they were passing on to their children. Others probably rationalized it as building character or upholding tradition or maintaining family honor. But the result was the same. Generation after generation of knights living difficult, dangerous, financially precarious lives, all for a system that benefited those at the very top while grinding down everyone below. Your children didn't choose to be born into a knightly family, but that accident of birth would determine their entire lives, limiting their options, defining their obligations, and quite possibly killing them in the same wars, tournaments, and political struggles that threatened you. The knightly legacy. It's not just about heraldry and family pride. It's about passing down a legacy of trauma, debt, and dangerous obligations that your children will then pass to their children forever. Conclusion: the reality behind the myth. So here we are, at the end of our journey through the genuine nightmare that was being a medieval knight. We've covered the armor that cooked or froze you, the brutal training that started at age 7, the crushing financial burden that bankrupted families, the horrors of actual battle, the constant risk of capture and ransom, the impossible political landscape, and all the rest of it. And I want to be clear, this isn't to say that medieval knights were bad people or that their culture had no value. Many knights genuinely tried to live up to ideals of courage, loyalty, and honor. Some succeeded, becoming genuinely admirable figures who protected those weaker than themselves and tried to use their power responsibly. The problem wasn't the individuals, it was the system they were trapped in. The feudal system, the endless wars, the tournament culture, the impossible financial pressures, the primitive medicine, the brutal training methods. All of this created conditions where even genuinely good people would struggle and often fail to live up to their own ideals. You could be the bravest, most honorable knight in the kingdom, and you'd still probably die young. From disease, battle injuries, or tournament accidents. You'd still probably live in constant pain from old wounds. You'd still probably struggle financially. You'd still probably watch friends and family members die from things that would be easily preventable or treatable today. The romantic image of knighthood, the shining armor, the noble quests, the chivalric honor, wasn't entirely fictional. Some of those ideals existed, and some knights genuinely tried to embody them. But those ideals existed within a context of brutal violence, grinding poverty for most people, primitive medicine, terrible hygiene, constant warfare, political instability, and a social system that valued some human lives far more than others. The reality was that being a knight meant signing up for a life of physical hardship, financial stress, political danger, and moral compromise. You'd be expected to be both a noble warrior, upholding chivalric ideals, and a practical enforcer of feudal hierarchies. You'd be supposed to protect the weak, while also extracting taxes and labor from peasants to fund your expensive lifestyle. You'd be told to be honorable and virtuous, while also participating in or witnessing atrocities during wars. The contradictions were built into the system, and individual knights had to navigate them as best they could. Some became cynical, seeing the ideals as propaganda and focusing on survival and advancement. Others became true believers, trying to live up to impossible standards, and often being disappointed or destroyed by the gap between ideal and reality. Most probably fell somewhere in between, doing their best in an impossible situation. And through it all, there was the constant threat of death, in battle, from disease, from accidents, from infected wounds, from political execution, from tournament injuries. Death was always present. Medieval people were more familiar with death than we are. They saw it from childhood. They lost siblings, parents, friends. They knew their own deaths could come at any time. This created a different relationship with mortality. Some people became fatalistic, accepting death as inevitable and out of their control. Others became deeply religious, hoping for a better afterlife, even if earthly life was terrible. Some lived recklessly, figuring they might as well enjoy what they could before death came for them. But however they dealt with it psychologically, the reality was that knights lived short lives by modern standards, often dying before they reached what we'd consider middle age, and often dying in ways that were painful, terrifying, or both. So why did people become knights? Why did the system persist for centuries if it was so terrible? Part of it was that there weren't really alternatives for people born into noble families. Social mobility was limited. If you were born the son of a knight, you'd probably become a knight yourself, whether that was actually what you wanted or not. Part of it was that the alternatives might be even worse. Being a peasant meant backbreaking agricultural labor, complete vulnerability to noble whims, and even less access to medical care or resources. Being a merchant or craftsman might be economically better, but lacked the social status and political power of nobility. And part of it was that some people genuinely did thrive in the knightly life. Some men were natural warriors who loved combat, didn't mind the hardships, and found meaning and purpose in the martial lifestyle. For them, being a knight might actually have been the best available option. But for many others, it was a trap, a social role they were born into and couldn't escape, that demanded everything from them and often gave very little back. The medieval period lasted roughly 1,000 years, and knightly culture evolved over that time. Early medieval knights were different from late medieval knights. Practices varied by region and time period. Not everything we've discussed applied equally to all knights everywhere, but the broad patterns held. Knighthood was physically dangerous, financially burdensome, politically complicated, and often psychologically devastating. The romantic image is largely a later invention, created by people far removed from the reality. When we look at medieval knights today, we should remember both the ideals they aspired to and the brutal reality they lived in. We can admire their courage and commitment while also recognizing that their lives were often short, painful, and filled with moral compromises. The past wasn't better than the present. The good old days of knights in shining armor were actually days of violence, disease, discomfort, and early death. We've built a mythology around knights that emphasizes the glory and adventure while downplaying or ignoring the horror and suffering. That mythology serves various purposes. It gives us heroes to admire. It provides exciting stories. It lets us imagine a simpler time when honor and courage supposedly mattered more than they do now. But it's important to also understand the reality behind the myth. Not to diminish the genuine accomplishments and virtues of historical knights, but to see them as complete human beings who lived in difficult circumstances and did their best with limited options. So the next time you see a movie or read a book about medieval knights with their gleaming armor and heroic deeds, remember that armor was cooking them alive or freezing them in winter. They were probably in debt. They might have chronic pain from old injuries. They were definitely itching from lice. They probably smelled terrible, and they stood a good chance of dying horribly before age 40. The reality of being a medieval knight? It genuinely, thoroughly sucked. And understanding why it sucked helps us appreciate both how far we've come and what the people of that era endured. They weren't living in a romantic adventure story. They were living in a harsh world with limited technology, primitive medicine, constant warfare, and social systems that valued some lives over others. They made the best of it that they could, and some of them did achieve remarkable things, despite the obstacles. But let's not romanticize the life they lived. Let's see it clearly, the good and the bad, the ideals and the reality, the glory and the horror. Being a medieval knight sucked. The armor, the training, the money problems, the battles, the tournaments, the ransoms, the feudal obligations. the crusades, the politics, the hygiene, the medicine, the legacy issues, all of it combined to create a lifestyle that was genuinely nightmarish in ways that no amount of later romantic mythologizing can erase. So yeah, when you were standing in that field in France in 1347, wearing 70 pounds of metal in the summer heat, desperately needing to pee, about to charge into a battle, that might kill you or bankrupt your family if you're captured, while dealing with chronic pain from old tournament injuries, worried about the debts you can't pay, and the political enemies back at court who are undermining you. In that moment, you'd probably be thinking, this sucks, and you'd be absolutely right. Thanks for joining me on this journey through the genuine horror of medieval knighthood. I hope you've learned something about the reality behind the romantic myths, and I hope you're grateful that you live in an era with antibiotics, anesthesia, indoor plumbing, and the option to choose careers that don't involve people trying to kill you while you're wearing 70 pounds of metal. The medieval period, fascinating to study, absolutely terrible to actually live through. See you next time, when we'll explore another historical topic that's probably way worse than you thought it was, because that's what we do here. We take your comfortable assumptions about the past and thoroughly ruin them with actual historical facts. Until then, stay safe, stay clean, and be grateful for modern medicine. This has been Why It Sucked to Be a Medieval Knight. Now you know.